Good evening. This is 21st Century Conversations. I'm Enzing Ashani. Our conversation this evening is about Black history. It's about Black self-love and a community healing network. I have with me this evening three people who are going to tell you why all of these things are important. And so I'll start with Jill. Tell us who you are.
Good evening, Nzinga. I'm Jill Snyder, and I'm on the board of the Community Healing Network.
And the Community Healing Network is based where?
It's based in New Haven, Connecticut.
At St. Luke's Church, right?
Yes, at St. Luke's Church is our home.
Okay. And with us is also Dr. Derek Gordon. Derek, tell us a little about you.
I am one of the directors at the Consultation Center at Yale, and I'm in the Department of Psychiatry here at the School of Medicine.
I see. And you specialize in looking at...
My work is focused primarily on men, men of color, and kind of thinking about how we increase their access to kind of healthy living, be it physical, mental, spiritual, emotional.
Thank you. And the Reverend Jerry Streets.
Hi, I'm Jerry Streets. I'm a clergy person, but I'm also a clinical social worker and on the faculty at the Worthwhile School of Social Work at Yeshiva University in New York City. And I have a specialty in trauma, looking at the ways in which people cope with and unfortunately go through traumatic experiences in their daily lives.
And so my question to all three of you is, why is it important for us to talk about Black self-love during Black History Month in particular, but at all times? Why is it important?
Well, we need more love in our community. We need more love, more forgiveness, more patience. Our history has taught us to suffer in silence, and a lot of us are in pain, and we act out our pain through anger and violence rather than in a healthy way expressing our emotions. And so even though we're desperately in need of love, a lot of the way we behave pushes away love.
We're going to talk a little about the Community Healing Network, and we're going to show the vision on the screen, which is the vision for the Community Healing Network, and why this vision and the mission is so important. So, Jill, tell us, the vision says a world in which every Black person is joyful about being Black.
Yes, we want to mobilize Black people to overcome the myth of Black inferiority. The myth of Black inferiority was used to dehumanize us and exploit us for centuries. And the emotional legacies, the trauma that we experienced is still with us. It's passed, the emotional legacies of that history is being passed on from one generation to the next.
Okay, thank you guys. We can now, Reverend Streets, talk about emotional legacy and the pain that Black people are in. And we know that that pain is manifested in so many ways. In 2010, there were 24 murders in New Haven. 24 Black people were killed in New Haven, and those were the 24 murders. There, it wasn't like there were 24 Black people and 6 other people. It was 24 Black people. 23 of them were men, and 1 young Black woman. She was 16 years old. It is believed that the people who committed those murders were also Black people. Tell us how that is a symptom of the pain that Jill talks about, and the pain, and the legacy.
Well, it's murder, as terrible as it is part of a larger problem in our culture of violence. Violence expresses itself in so many different ways: domestic violence, violence against children, child abuse, and we can go on and on with it. But the stem is violence, and we have been exposed to so much oppression over decades, over centuries. It contradicts our history, though. As a people, we have been a strong people, a strong community, and being violent in the ways in which it's popularly promoted about us in the media is the exception and not the norm. But in today's world, violence can be an expression of so many things, but it is often an expression of depression. It's an expression of low self-esteem. It's an expression of feeling powerless, and then one way to assert yourself in the world is to act out. And if you've only learned how to act out in destructive ways, that's the repertoire you're going to use.
Dr. King talked about this. He talked about the need for self-determination and self-love. And we're going to hear from Dr. King. We have a 2-minute clip of Dr. King speaking about this so many years ago, and it's still true today. And when we come back from hearing this clip, I'm going to ask Derek to tell us why after, now we know Dr. King was killed in 1968, here we are in 2011, and we're still can't seem to get a hold of that self-determination piece. Can we hear from Dr. King, please?
And I come here tonight and plead with you. Believe in yourself and believe that you're somebody. And as I said to the group last night, nobody else can do this for us. No document can do this for us. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation can do this for us. No Kennysonian or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can do this for us. If the Negro is to be free, he must move down into the inner resources of his own soul and sign with a pen and ink of self-assertive manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. Don't let anybody take your manhood. Be proud of our heritage. As somebody said earlier tonight, we don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean. But I want to get the language right tonight. I want to get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful.
We need to get the language right. He said we need to sign our own proclamation of freedom. And somebody told the lie that everything that is black is ugly, and that we really don't have any control. Why is that more important today than ever? It was important, of course, in 1968. Why is it important in 2011?
When I think about it, I think about the whole issue of, two things come to mind. One is the issue of resources, and one is the issue of capacity. Mm-hmm. Kind of thinking about, do I have the resources available within me to kind of meet that standard, and do I have the skills to kind of actually carry it out, And so when I reflect on the words of Dr. King, those are things that come to me as I think about that. In kind of thinking about black self-love, do I have what it takes, and do I have the skills to actually live it?
How do you get the skills, Jerry?
Well, for me, it's basically one that starts in the home, if possible. That part of raising children is to do so in such a way that you nurture their self-esteem. That we need to reemphasize and have a really national campaign in this country about the healthy psychosocial development of children and parenting, so that parents can be reintroduced or introduced perhaps for the first time what it takes to really nurture a child's self-esteem, the small ways in which a child's ego can be damaged, and without the parent even realizing that he or she is doing it, and certainly no intention for them to do it. One of our poets, Cuney, C-U-N-E-Y, has a poem, and the last line in the poem is, "And dishwater gives back no images." And what he was trying to say there, or at least I'm interpreting, as one would interpret a poem, is that you need reference points for the aspirations that you need in life. You need to have images. You need to have models. We might call them role models today. But you have to have reference points that says this is who you are and this is who you can become. And racism has been a form of dishwater. When you look in dishwater, you get no reflection, or what you see is dirty, murky water. And when you have constant assault on your self-esteem, eventually you start to look as if you look at yourself as if you're dishwater.
Yes, yes.
It also raises a question, Nzinga, around the issue of, and I think Jerry kind of alluded to this, is about the role that social networks play in facilitating one's development. You know, if I have people around me who are also vested in my development and my growth, and they demonstrate to me, I think one of the reasons why families become important is that if you have an intact family, you have two models of how to accomplish those things. You know, and then if you have an extended family network, you have that times that network of models of how you actually accomplish similar things. And so in that way, the resources that are available to you are kind of endless, you know, because you then realize you're not limited to one way of being or one way of doing things. And so it kind of opens up the world in some ways to you.
Which is consistent with our history. We have to remember that the people who protested long before even Dr. King, and certainly with Dr. King, were men and women whose sense of self had that kind of integrity and quality, because that's what enabled them to stand up to the oppression that was around them, and to cope with it, and in some cases to really thrive. Think about 1960 with the little Ruby Bridges, 6 years old, integrating a public school in New Orleans, being escorted to school by federal marshals. The picture that Norman Rockwell captured so well. 6 years old.
My God.
Now, what does it take for a 6-year-old to walk between two federal marshals and then people on the margins of the sidewalk spitting at her, calling her all kinds of names? She went home to a family whose parents said, Ruby, you're beautiful, you're great, you're a pioneer, you're doing great things. Certainly the federal government was there to support it, but there was also a community, there was a church. When people threatened her parents and caused her father to lose his job, they got together and provided resources to support them during those times that he couldn't work. These are all expressions of saying, you're somebody, you're so valuable, you're so lovable, that we were going to invest ourselves in you.
But here's the thing. Those, back in the 60s, we thought about how terrible things were, right? I was watching recently when James Meredith, it took the federal marshals to get James Meredith, to register, to safely register in school. We're supposed to have improved so much as a society. We're supposed to have come so far. Why today, so many years later, the Rubies in New Haven don't seem to have that family support and love?
And I think that gets back to those emotional legacies. We don't like to think about what it was really like for our ancestors in slavery and in Jim Crow. People were brutalized, women were raped, and that they had no support, no psychological help to recover from that. And think of what happens, for example, of a woman who's raped, with the psychological trauma she goes through. If she has children, they're going to have a reaction. They're going to absorb her depression or her anger or whatever, and they may not know the reason why she behaves that way, but that behavior and the thought process is carried on through the generations. And when we try to talk with families, talk with people about dealing with that history, people are like, oh, why do we have to talk about that? We don't want to talk about that.
But what I'm saying is, Jill, I appreciate what you're saying. I understand it. My question is, those legacies were there in the 1960s. When Ruby was going to break, those legacies were there in the 60s. They were there in the 70s. We're further away from those legacies today. Why are they still having such an impact? Why?
Because there are more social pressures and social factors that contribute to our health and well-being.
Okay, how do we change it, Jerry?
Well, I mean, when you look at our society at large, the impact of the economy, the chronic stress that people are under, we know that the incidences of hypertension, diabetes, cancer, heart problems are not just caused by poor eating habits. Some people are eating right, some people are exercising, but they have to deal with a larger social structure. They deal with chronic insults to their integrity because of racist attitudes or discriminatory attitudes. They're dealing with sexism, they're dealing with homophobia, they're dealing with racism. And when you have these kind of emotional encounters day in and day out, year after year, you have to learn how to deal with those emotions. Otherwise, emotions take up residence in the body, and the body expresses those stressors often in ways that contributes to our illness. And so we are not as isolated from those impacts of those factors as we once were. Now, one this is a very controversial thing, but we have people in our community to say, segregation may have been at its time morally wrong and terrible, but we were healthier under segregation because we relied on one another and we supported one another.
Yes.
And in ways now that we're too permeable. I mean, it's too much is impacting our community.
And I think word role models was mentioned before.
Yes.
And I think by moving out and moving on up into that cohesive community not being there anymore, you don't have role models.
I was talking to an outreach worker last week, and this young man, he's 29 years old, he said, and he told me that he had an 80-year-old child in school whose mother was 21. The mother is 21 and the child is 8. And he said to me that in an interaction with this mother, she didn't have a clue about what to do for her child when her child was having problems. And her answer was that, well, if my child's having problems, it's somebody else's fault. And so she was angry because she really didn't know how to manage the situation. And he said, there are so many children like that. She needs somebody to raise her. She's not yet reached maturity, but she has to deal with all these issues. And what I hear you saying is that because we have moved out, we no longer have segregation to the extent it did, but we no longer have the community support either.
On some levels, that's true.
On some levels, yes.
I also think that there's like a fundamental flaw within that whole structure too, because prior to now, that young woman would have support to help her raise that child. And so the issue for me is, and so we talk about, yes, we are we're removed from Dr. King's legacy, but I think a challenge that we're actually also facing is that in that removing, we're also bombarded with the larger social forces that are out there. So she has to do this all by herself, and if she's not doing it, if something is wrong, then there's somebody else to blame for it. So I just raised a question about how much does that reflect the American zeitgeist, the American way of thinking. It's not my fault, and somebody's out there, it's someone else out there's fault, and we need to figure out who that person is and go blame them, rather than begin to say, okay, there might be truth to that in some instances. Yes. However, there might be times when I have a role to play in my current context. And how do I sit with that and understand that before I think about what the other causes might be? Yeah,
and the challenge is always trying to figure out how to hold any community responsible for its own well-being without also taking society off the hook for the larger ways in which it contributes to the pathology and to the ill health of people. It's not just black people who are experiencing this kind of pressure, as a young woman example you gave. However, here's one possible difference. A white young woman with the same narrative, 21 with an 8-year-old on her own, would not be seen as inferior to the black woman who's 21 with an 8-year-old. That somehow the 21-year-old black young woman is 21 and unmarried and with a child because somehow or another she didn't have her values straight.
And that's what Dr. King was talking about, the ugliness that's associated with. So
there's a negative association with black people that's not associated with other groups.
How do we change that for ourselves? What do parents watching this program and teachers in the black community, what do they say, what do they do for the 11 and 12-year-old black girls and boys in their classrooms and in their homes that will prevent them getting to where that 21-year-old is perceived to be today? What do we say? How is the Community Healing Network an answer?
Well, as we talked about it, mission is healing, and we see healing there's a couple components. One is really it's about our thought process and how we think, and the other is squarely telling the truth. We avoid a lot of truth, and I think another legacy of our past is that we have a lot of secrets, and we're reluctant to, maybe due to shame, I don't know, we're reluctant to tell it like it is sometimes. And so we enable each other to not confront things, and because I don't want to deal with my stuff, so I'm not going to talk about your stuff.
Yes. In fact, there is a situation where someone once, when there was a very bad situation that was being led by a black person, other black people said, we cannot deal with this openly because it will look bad on the community.
Yes. Exactly.
But that doesn't mean that the community still shouldn't deal with it. I mean, that's as I hear Jill, one of Jill's points is that, and coupled with what Dr. King said, he said no one can do it for us but us, but we have to take responsibility for our own well-being.
Yes.
Sure, there are social factors involved, and we should never be slight in calling those social factors out, but we shouldn't hesitate to call each other to a higher standard and expectations within our own community.
Yes.
And so that means articulating values again about what constitutes healthy relationships, what's healthy family lifestyles, and recognizing that there are a variety of lifestyles, not just traditional as we might say it, that are healthy for people and for raising children.
Yes.
And so we need that conversation inside of our community, but in a way that's loving and healing, not in a way that's criticizing and condoning and putting down.
Exactly.
But I think there's a way in which to not deal with that is to kind of perpetuate the same kind of trauma that we're talking about. So I would argue that it does need to be addressed. How is an important factor, but it must be addressed, because what we want to do is mark that, and I think various people think about it in different ways. How do you have those authentic conversations with individuals such that, one, they can hear it, and then two, you have to be in a place to be able to hear it. So, if I've stepped on your foot and you don't like that, how do you come and let me know that?
Yes,
and how do I sit down and hear that I may have caused you harm, intentional or not? And take some ownership around that. So part of it is, how do we begin to be authentic around that?
Well, you see, we'll get to a great place, because the Community Healing Network has a suggested reading list, and we want to show this reading list, and we're going to ask you to talk about why are these books important before we go to our 30-minute break. So can we look at this reading list? And this is just an abbreviated list, and it says there, A Song Flung Up to Heaven by Dr. Maya Angelou, Rock My Soul, Black People and Self-Esteem by Bell Hooks, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, and The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And these, again, are just 4 of the books that the Community Healing Network has on its website, and we encourage people you can find a much wider list on the Community Healing Network. And if we can put up the web address for Community Healing Network, I think it's communityhealingnet.org.
Yes.
Right? communityhealingnet.org. Derek, you talk about the importance of having a place to have this conversation. Jerry, Jill, tell us about what the Community Healing Network is doing to create those places for people to read these books and have conversations.
Well, we're trying to create a movement just because we don't want it to turn into finger pointing.
Yes.
You know, you're wrong, you're bad. It's about all of us healing, and it's everyone. We don't want people to think, well, I don't need healing because I've succeeded, I've achieved.
Yes.
It's really all of us that need to be involved in this, and we're seeking to launch in New Haven in April a community healing circle,
Yes.
a safe place where people can come together and talk, and we'll read the books that you mentioned, recommend movies, and encourage people to do things, use self-help tools like writing in a journal, confiding in a trusted friend, and to begin helping people to realize that their lives can change, to be open to the idea of change, not as I'm bad, I need to change, but that change is what's going to help me have a better life.
Now,
It's about helping people, encouraging people to think about what does wholeness mean to them. That
Yes.
healing may sound to some people like, oh, well, I'm not sick, or I'm not crazy, so I don't need. It's not just those categories, but it's about having a sense. That's not going to be okay for my family or for my children, So teaching one another what constitutes wholeness and healthiness,
Yes.
and then modeling it for our children is a very important part of our 21st agenda as a Black community.
I think it also builds off of the issue that I think that's there, which is within the Black community, there is a narrow bandwidth within which one can operate, so you don't have a lot of move. There's not a way in which you can be Black. So to be Black is just to be one or two things, and so that was never the case, and that should never be the case. And so I think this relates to kind of what Dr. Streets was talking about, having to do with how do you create a space where there can be multiple voices? How can you create a space where one's identity, one's Black identity, is not confined to a narrow pie, but it's actually the whole pie.
But Derek, within the Black community, you have adults, and you have adults who you would expect to know better, saying to other Black adults, you don't know that you're Black. You're not acting, you're acting white. And this is coming from people who you would think people who have gone to college, people who have, but it seems as if the mental chains of slavery is there. How do we break that? How do we, these are some of our leaders in our community. How do you get that cycle broken so that our children don't buy into the same thing? You have Black kids who don't want to be considered smart. They don't want to be considered geeky They don't want to. I just had in October, we did a forum with teens, and after the forum, a young lady said to me, even at my school, you have black kids who don't want to hang out with me.
But see, this goes back to the limitation of reference points.
Yeah.
If you have people saying to succeed is not black, you have to have ways to let them know how many black people are succeeding in those ways that would appear to be, quote, non-black.
Yes, which is why I believe in showcasing positive young black people and successful young people of all stripes. But I certainly like to focus on young black people who are doing great things, who are doing extremely well in school, who are very articulate. I like to showcase them because I'm saying to other young black people, this can be you. This can be you. The potential is within you. Go ahead.
I just want to add, I also think that conformity is sort of a way for people to cope. It's almost a survival mechanism. If I go along with the crowd, maybe my world is unsafe. My home isn't safe, the neighborhood isn't safe, but one thing I can try to do is sort of fit in and blend in and conform to what are the norms around me. And so I think when we look at these things and we have these observations, we have to think of them with love and patience and try to dig down a little bit as to why people are behaving the way they are.
And I think related to the whole idea of camouflage. I think there are oftentimes a lot of us, and we do it in different ways, but a lot of us like to hide in public. As you talk about it, that's the idea that comes to my mind. And so the issue is I won't draw attention to myself because if I do so, I then become a target. Now, you think about us being here tonight, I'm sure that there are folks who will be like, well, why do they get to speak about this?
Yes.
and the truth about it, it's a very good question. Why do we get to speak about this issue? There could be, another side, group of four who could have this conversation in a very good way also.
Yes.
And so it's not that we do have some expertise, but it's not that we're the only people who can speak to this issue. And so kind of recognizing that, yes, this conversation is not just limited to us, and it can include a lot of other people.
Absolutely.
We just have to be the folks that are here today.
Okay.
And that conformity parallels stereotyping. Conformity reduces expectations, and it also reduces accountability. If one can just conform rather than really stretch to meet his or her potential, then that breaks the mold, you see.
Oh, yes, and Jerry, those of us who don't conform certainly pay a price.
If you pay a price either way.
Yes,
you pay a price either way. Whether you conform or not, you're paying a price.
Yes, and so
you
we
decide which price you want to pay.
Yes, exactly. I am so glad we got there. You're watching 21st Century Conversations. We're talking about Black History Month, Black Self-Love, and a community healing network. With me are three people who have been working in this area in one form or another, and they are, tell us your name again.
Jill Snyder.
And look over there so people can see you.
Jill Snyder on the board of the Community Healing Network.
Yes, and?
I'm Derek Gordon, Dr. Gordon from the Consultation Center, Department of Psychiatry at Yale.
And I get a chance to have two titles, a Reverend Dr. Jerry Street, clergy and clinical social worker and professor at the Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University in New York City.
And Jerry, you are also on the advisory board
of the Community Healing Network. Yes.
Okay, now, we want people to know that the Community Healing Network is the creator and sponsor of Community Healing Days. You can get more information. You can send an email to them, in fact, at info@communityhealingnet.org, or you may visit their website at communityhealing.org with the 3 W's in front of it. And the Community Healing Network is the place that is giving a lot of information about this whole idea of finding wholeness, Black people finding wholeness. You might learn more about this also by visiting the multicultural section of our OneWorld Progressive Institute website. And OneWorld is the producer and sponsor of 21st Century Conversations. Thank you, guys. And we we believe so strongly, we at OneWorld, and Enola Aird, who is sort of gave birth to CHN, who couldn't be with us tonight because of an emergency. Enola firmly believes in the need for Black people to take control of their lives, take back and defy the stereotypes, and look at how we can change the trajectory, certainly for our children and our grandchildren coming up. We talked before about the book list, and the Community Healing Network also supports something called Community Healing Movie Club. And we want to show some of the movies that the Community Healing Network has recommended. So can we go to the slide, please? Here, the Community Healing Movie Club, this is a suggestion of the Community Healing Network that you can do it in your church, you can do it in your community organization, you can do it within your family. We suggest these movies, but there are many others. We suggest these as sort of some of the top ones. Antoine Fisher, directed by Denzel Washington. A Place of Our Own, which is a documentary by Stanley Nelson. Beloved, which is written by Toni Morrison, right? And the movie is directed by Jonathan Demme. The Great Debaters, directed by Denzel Washington, which is a wonderful sort of a semi-documentary. And Pride, directed by Suni Ganera. Thank you, guys. Now, why are these movies? Antoine Fisher, did you all see Antoine Fisher? What do you have to say about Antoine Fisher? Why people should start a movie club with Antoine Fisher?
Well, it speaks directly to what we're talking about, the emotional legacies of slavery. If you saw the movie and watched it as entertainment, we invite you to look at it again and really understand what Denzel, and how he healed the young man from the abuse he had suffered as a child by helping him understand the context of why that abuse took place. And I think understanding the context of why people are the way they are. I think I had a flash of understanding one day when I thought about some of the ways my parents talked to me and behaved, and realized that it was a result of the context that they had come through, and why a lot of what they did was to protect us from racism, and they tried to shield us in many ways, but that shielding in a way keeps you from achieving your potential. Like, don't try to do that. Black people, they won't let Black people do that. And I heard that as a child. So
but isn't it interesting? We live in a time now where we're surrounded by very visual symbols of contradiction. You have an African-American president who in the world of politics has achieved the pinnacle. So we can say to our young people, yes, you can become president on the one hand, but then on the other hand, we're still trying to teach them how to cope when they encounter racism, that there will be obstacles no matter, even though we have a Black president. I would add, for an example, to that list, Malcolm X, directed by Spike Lee.
Oh, yes.
And
there are many more movies on the website. These are just the leaders that we said, but Malcolm X, absolutely.
But what they all have in common is how, if you will, how our narrative as a people is a story told about overcoming obstacles, by realistically looking at those obstacles and addressing them and transforming them. And in this way, we're no different than any other group in America. It's a part of a larger human narrative. The slight difference is the insidious, persistent nature of racism. Other groups overcome all kinds of bigotry and succeed, in fact become the leaders of the country and part of the mainstream. We succeed over also tremendous odds, but we're still relegated to quite not in the most top of anything. There's still a little bit of marginalization that goes on because of racism, and it's so easy for the public discourse in the U.S. to revert back to old racial cliches and animosities. It's so easy for people to use racial jokes and the N-word and whatnot, or be discriminated against.
Look what they do to the president.
Well, I'm just saying, but when you hear those kind of things, you have to have a way to filter them.
Yes.
And you have to have a way to buffer that from affecting your spirit and your psyche, so that you can move on and move forward.
Yes.
Jerry and Derek, I want to, and Jill, to ask you all this question, because we talk about at a time when we're supposed to have achieved the highest office possible, President Obama is President of the United States, yet still, if you listen to some of the hate mongers on
But they will always be there.
Yes,
They've
but I've
always been
never
there.
seen, I've lived in this country now for many, many years, I've never seen the type of mockery of any president that I've seen of President Obama.
But it's just an extension of racist mockery of black people.
That's my point.
Yeah.
So how do we teach our children, Derek? How do we teach our children to cope with that? What do we deal with it?
I think that there are multiple ways that I kind of think about it. I think that Jerry's initial statement about the whole idea of transformation is important. One of the ways in which I think the black community has survived is to be able to take adverse situations and transform them into kind of, uplifting situations. In all the movies that you've described, there's some kind of transformation that's going on.
Yes.
Where they take this negative event and they make it positive. Or they find the kernels of positiveness in it. And so the question becomes, it's not that, I think this is my experience, and I think for people growing up, it might be a little bit different. I hope for my son it'll be a little bit different. But, I don't expect that everything will be easy. I expect that there will be challenges. The question becomes, how do I take those challenges and deal with them and make things better? And so it's not that adversity isn't going to come. It's when adversity comes, here's how you deal with it.
Yes,
And I think that's always been a part of the black narrative in general, across the diaspora. So then, that being said, we have to kind of prepare our kids to kind of recognize that these issues will show up in your lived experience, but you have the skills and the tools to do it. How do you face it? How do you deal with that? But the other thing is that it's like your car. It's like your cell phone. It needs recharging every so often.
Yes,
and we get recharged from those that we care about and those that we can kind of rely on as our resources.
I like that Jerry mentioned about the Malcolm X movie, because that's certainly one of the movies that I strongly recommend. And again, if people go and visit the CHN website, communityhealingnet.org, you will get a much wider list of both movies and books. And we're going to share with you some questions, how you can start your own discussion group, your own movie club, some of the questions you can ask. But one of the reasons that I so much admire the movie Antoine Fisher, because after this young man went through such horrendous childhood, when he met the woman who was supposed to be his biological mother, but when he went back to the place where he was raised in this brutal home, he looked the woman in the face when she tried to hug him, and he said, "Don't touch me." And he says, "I want you to know that I am strong and I'm a good person." It's again taking control of the narrative. And when he met the woman who gave birth to him, as much as he felt sadness for her, he was glad he met her, but he said it's an experience he didn't have to repeat. He didn't have to go back and claim all that negative stuff, because he now learned how to be strong and to move on, because Denzel Washington.
But part of dealing with that is for our community to recognize that some of what we're going through is not unlike what other communities go through.
Yes.
So the double sense of shame is removed. You can have the normal shame as a human being who unfortunately had a terrible experience.
Yes.
But when you think that you're the only one that's going through it, or your community is the only one, you don't want to talk about it too much, because you don't want to reinforce the stereotype in the larger culture's mind that here it is, the black folks going through their stuff again, right? So it's a matter of creating, I think what Dr. Derek said, that safe space to let people know that some of this is just the human drama, and we have to tease out where the racist elements are in it, and where is the larger human drama part of it. And one of I know we're talking about different resources, but I tell you, I am just so thrilled to be reading Warmth of Other Suns by Wilkerson.
Yes, we have that on the list too.
Because the way
Warmth
she
of Other
traces
Suns, yes.
the way she traces the migration of African Americans from the South from the 1930s forward is a wonderful story about doing exactly what
Yes, the
Dr.
Warmth of
Derrick
Other Suns.
said.
Tell us who is the author.
Wilkerson.
Yes, Wilkerson. And also, Michelle Alexander just came out with a book that I think is really good too. Jim Crow something.
Well,
It's really
the
good.
point I'm trying to make
Go ahead,
about
yes.
with the immigration,
Yes.
these are men and women who left the South, many of them literally with nothing but was on their back. And how they relocated to Chicago, Texas, California, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and recreated themselves in a new environment, in an urban environment. So we forget how recreative we have been for
Yes.
centuries.
Yes.
Even in the time of slavery, we were still recreating ourselves. We weren't always docile and accepting, and we didn't always fit the stereotypes that races have characterized us as fitting. So we need to, part of our healing needs to have a correction of our historical view of ourselves, is what Jill was mentioning.
Yeah, which is what these healing circles. So I want to give people some suggestions that came from the Community Healing Network, some of the movie questions. So we're suggesting you start a book club.
Yes.
A reading circle, a community healing reading circle. We suggest you start a movie club, and to help you get started with some of the discussion questions for any of the movies that have been suggested, we want you to look at some of these discussion questions. And can we go to the, yes, do you see the myth of black inferiority at work in the movie? What damage is done to the men and women in the movie? And this is true for all the movies that we have recommended. How did the myth get passed on to people in the story? In what ways is this movie like real life for black people? What steps can we take to overcome the myth? That's a critical question that we must ask ourselves. What steps can we take to overcome the myth? And so those are some of the questions you can start your group with.
And what movies would you like to create for the future?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. What movie? I know you have a book.
Oh, yeah, I mean, this book is by Kurt Brian Jones, an African-American. It's called Holy Play,
Yes.
The Joyful Adventure of Releasing Your Divine Purpose. Now, I know it has that kind of prosperity tone to it.
Yes.
But Kurt is a clergy person, pastored a number of churches, who realized his calling was as a writer. And what he does in this text is help people to think through their understanding of their relationship with God and how to nurture their spirits beyond a kind of denominational approach.
Yes.
And I think for many of our people, the very religious practices they engage in, they find not as liberating as they would hope for them to be.
Yes.
For whatever number of reasons, be the humanity of the people in churches, we're all made of, have feet of clay, but we need to take, just like we take our bodies seriously, we feed ourselves, we bathe, we need to take our spirits seriously and nurture them. And in addition to the book clubs and the discussions, I wonder, like, Lent is coming up for those who practice Lent.
Yes.
Why not say for the 40 days of Lent, each day is going to be a day of self-affirmation and meditating on the gift that I am from God, rather than on the sinner I am supposed to be from God.
Yes.
To shift that around.
Yes.
I say to people often, according to the mythological story, if you think it's a myth, or the true story of the creation, after God created humankind, he didn't look at the creation and say, this is perfect. He looked at it and said, it's good.
Yes.
So how can we reconnect with the goodness that is really our nature? And so use Lent as a time for daily meditations, for exercise, for a new diet perhaps, for a new affirmation, to take small steps. There's no insignificant step. There's no such thing as a small step versus a large step when it comes to this. Every step is significant, and every step is important.
Okay, let me go ahead.
Can I just jump in?
Sure.
I also think it's important, as we talk about this, to consider that So I'm going to use a little. One of the things we know about this work is that it's not linear, and that it's like going out. It's like the beginning of the year. Everybody's going to go on a diet. They're going to go on the gym. They're going to do all those things.
Yes.
And by now, by this time of the year, they're stopped. And then they feel as if they've failed. The challenge is you've not failed.
Right.
You started. The issue is how do you get back up after you've discontinued going? I joke all the time and I say I have this very funny relationship with the treadmill because
Yes.
I run for a month and a half, then I don't run for 2 months, and I run for a month and a half. But I don't feel as if I've lost anything necessarily. The issue is, as you do, like what Dr. Streets recommended, how do you continue to do that even after you stop for a bit? And how do you pick up from there and continue to go? That'd be an important piece because that's part of the process. And what the hope is over time, the time between you stopping and starting becomes shorter. And so it becomes less of a disconnect, and it becomes a part of your regular routine.
Okay, I want to give people the contact information again for the Community Healing Network and to talk a little bit about the church. We're putting out a call for the church. This is really your piece. But we want to go to the graphic to show people the Community Healing Network invites churches to create healing places. You can call it a healing circle, you can call it a healing group, but places where, as Dr. Street said, people feel safe to really put out their concerns. The contact for the Community Healing Network there, as you see, the website is communityhealingnet.org. You can email at info@communityhealing.net. And you can also, of course, find this information at the OneWorld website at oneworldpi.org. Now, I would like for each of you to tell us, again, we talk about finding these places of where we can be safe. Dr. Streets, I know black people go to church a lot, and lots of black people go to church, but there are those black people who don't go to church,
Right.
and who don't have an affiliation with a religious body. For those, especially for our young parents, those parents who are in their 20s and 30s who might not have found a church home or, for whatever reason, don't go to church. How can they start? And Jill, in terms of the Community Healing Network, what, if any, kind of outreach do you have to those people? And how do we get other churches to create these healing circles? So that's for all three of you. And we have about 7 minutes left into the program. So
I would be the last person to say that you have to be religious in order to go to church. There are a lot of people who would describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. As an example, it's a very common description these days. But for anyone, whether they're young or not so young, who's not affiliated with any kind of organized religion, that's not to say that they're not spiritual. And it's also not to say that they don't take their spirituality seriously. Whether they're a member of a church or not, they ought to incorporate some kind of spiritual meditation, reflection in their own life and share that they do that with their children or with the people in their family so they can model that. Even if it's just a 5-minute meditation every day. It's a great thing to say to your child, before I go out to work, I take 5 minutes and I read the 23rd Psalm, or I take 5 minutes and I pray, or I take 5 minutes and I meditate. And the child will say, what's prayer? What's meditation? What's the Psalm? You can have a conversation about that. So you can encourage a kind of spiritual way of thinking about how to live your daily life, whether you're active in the church or not.
Just to get centered, just taking a few minutes to get calm.
Sure.
And before you go out into the hustle and bustle. So, Jill, what is the Community Healing Network at St. Luke's doing to reach out to other churches?
Well, we see ourselves as, we're small, or just a few of us, as a wholesale organization. In other words, we don't reach out a lot to individuals. We're seeking to work through all kinds of organizations, churches, community groups, professional organizations. And Enola, who, as we said, couldn't be here today, is doing a lot of that work. And we're building a connection with the Black Psychiatrists, the national organization, to help to get them to infuse these ideas into their work as they're treating people. We're hoping to partner with some of the fraternities and sororities so that we can connect with a cross-section of people who are both either directly in one of the helping professions or clergy, or have contacts that are broad so that we can reach many people. And I just have one more thing. May I add on the spirituality? And if people aren't really in a place where they're accustomed to praying and meditating, one thing that everyone can do is to think each day a few minutes about what they have to be grateful for.
Oh, yes. And journaling. I find journaling to be very, very helpful. Just taking those few minutes, sit down and write. If something good happened to you, write it down. And if something challenging happened, write it down and say, how am I going to deal with this going forward? Derek, we are down to about 2 minutes, so I want you to take a minute to tell us, to say to people tonight, what should they do going forward to make a change? One thing they can do to make a change for the better, for something more positive in their lives.
Well, I kind of think about, I feel as if all of us are evolving.
Yes.
Who I was 5 years ago is not who I am today, and hopefully is not who I'm going to be 5 years from now. So the challenge becomes, envision who that person that you want to be, and begin to think about what are the steps that I need to do to get there, and begin taking one step at a time. The challenge for us oftentimes is that we think that we have to accomplish it all in one fell swoop. We live in an immediate society. I want it now.
Yes.
I don't want it tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but I want it now. That being said, how do we then take those baby steps to get us closer to who we want to be? And recognize when we get to that person, who we want to be would have changed.
Yes.
And it's somebody else. But we're always striving. And so I think that becomes an important piece. Think about that and just begin to take one step at a time.
Before we go off, I want to remind people that they can find out more about our conversation this evening about Black Self-Love by again visiting communityhealingnet.org or visiting OneWorldPI.org and look at our multicultural section where you can get a lot of information.
I would say, too, to this list of things, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yes. But you see, I want you to wrap up, Reverend Streets, although I'm not...
I don't know if I could do that.
Although I'm not a religious person, I do want you, as a religious person, to talk about... We had 24 murders in New Haven last year. As I said, 23 young black men were killed and 1 young black woman. It is believed by other young black people. For the parents of those young people who died, what do you want to leave them with as solace to help them, that if they have other children, they don't end up that way? What can parents tonight, what one thing can they say to their children that's going to help to prevent more tragedies like what we saw last year?
It's very difficult for many people to imagine, as a parent, losing a child. And so we should not assume that we know how that it feels to those parents. Having said that, though, I think it's important to let parents know that it's whatever they're feeling, those feelings are all right.
Yes.
But they need to also, in the context of those feelings, reassure their children that are with them that people are basically good, that life is worth living, and that you, parent, love them, and that you will do all you can to protect them.
Yes, we have to go. Thank you so much. It is so important that we tell our children that we love them, even in the midst of chaos, and that we want what's best for them, and do everything we can to help them to cope with the stresses that's out there. I'm glad you joined us for this conversation. Join us again for another 21st Century Conversation, wherever you're watching this one.